Well, hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name's Susan O'Sullivan, and I'm here with Julie DeVere, who's our Director of Museum Collections and Curator. We are so happy to have you join us tonight. Julie's going to talk about the kitchen and all the historic elements that we're highlighting in the kitchen right now on the display in the house. And Julie and I are enjoying our Manhattans. And we hope that you have your cocktail or mocktail of choice or your Manhattan of choice to join us as well. So we'll get started. Julie, take it away.
Well, I love, when we looked for the most popular cocktail of each decade, the Manhattan, which actually was invented in the 19th century, like the 1870s, came back into vogue in the 40s and was like one of the most popular cocktails of the decade. And the kitchen, we are re-showing and reinterpreting during wartime, during World War II, right between about 1939 and 1945. So it was a fun drink to pull out, and I love the best description I've seen of it yet is a simple balance of herbs, grains, spice, fruit, purr, and bite. So I hope you're enjoying yours as well. So one of the things that we were working on during the shelter in place was making new fake food for you to enjoy, the Filoli fakery, as we call it. And so Jellos were a really big popular thing during this period. And it was because of wartime rationing. And so you would actually make these Jello salads, and some of them were more savory than sweet. That one actually would have originally had a lime Jello mix in it, and it has suspended vegetables, and it's meant to be a salad course. So aspics, which had become so popular, really continued full force into the war because it allowed you to stretch food. And so we talk a lot about wartime rationing. We also have ration books that are out, and these were fun. One of my previous museums, the Campbell Historical Museum and Historic Ainsley House, I knew that we had these in their collection, and so their collection staff, my colleagues let me borrow them, and we were able to fill them out for Roth family and staff. So you'll be able to see those, and you know, it was important because after Pearl Harbor, one of the things that was enacted was the Emergency Price Control Act. In that they told you if you don't need it, don't buy it. And so here we all just sort of lived through another moment in time of hoarding and people getting nervous and anxious and running out and buying things. And so those first few weeks of shelter in place, I was spending quite a lot of time on ration books and looking at all these Victory Garden advertisements and wartime rationing and all of the kind of basically like propaganda art, but pushing, you know, what they wanted the message to be was, you know, don't allow empty shelves to win the war, you know, support your neighbors, don't overbuy, help one another, can your own food, plant a Victory Garden. And so you'll be seeing a lot about that, even outside in the garden this summer. There's more interpretation happening out there talking about Victory Gardens. And I know I planted a giant vegetable garden myself at home the last few months, and I'm now taking the winnings are bundles full of squash and tomatoes and beans and everything. So it was something that, you know, we've done during World War I, World War II. It's a great response to the wartime effort. And the Roths knew quite a lot about the wartime effort, especially right as World War II was in full production, full mode. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, the Lurleen was actually en route back to San Francisco from Hawaii, and they were ordered to go dark, turn off all their lights, and just get home as quickly as possible. And the minute they unloaded, they were immediately refitted as a wartime vessel. So there was 11 Matson ships that ended up being lost, but they had 4 passenger ships and 35 freighters at the start of the war that were basically taken over by the war effort. Their personnel their ships, and all of the Roth hotels in Hawaii, especially all of those in Waikiki, were taken over by the War Times Act. And so the hotels, I love that they were used to allow rest and relaxation for submarine crews, so that they had a break when they were on leave, and a chance to kind of recoup before you go back into that high stress situation. And they basically, they painted all those white cruise ships battleship gray. They were troop carriers. They were taking people back and forth all over the Pacific. And the freighters were used to take supplies all over. And by the end of the war, they said they had lost 11 ships, and that almost all of the ships that were remaining, especially the passenger ships, after a lot of hard wartime effort and kind of being stripped of a lot, they said that they were sort of on their last legs, and that it was an estimated $16 million per ship to renovate them. So that was a really big, you know, personal impact of the war on the Roths while they were here. But they had sort of a great moment to change their business operation that came out of it. And so at the end of the war in 1948, they decided, okay, well, if we're gonna build a new fleet, what does this new fleet look like? And they built new cruise ships, and they built their first containerization freighters, and they end up being the first one to take containerized shipping into the Pacific. And that was really what they became so well known for, and that's still what so many people, especially here in the Bay Area, know them for, is the big Matson, you know, logo that we still see on container ships, is all over. And so they really, in the 50s, you start to see the containerization, the kind of, I don't know what they're actually called, the container lifters that kind of take everything back and forth and put them onto the ship. All of those start popping up around San Francisco Bay in the 50s. And that was because this whole change to containerization was happening.
Could you remind our viewers, what were the Roths hotels that were in Waikiki?
So in Waikiki, they had a number of different hotels. Because I always leave out one of them, I actually gave myself a little note. So it's the Princess Kalilani, the Royal Hawaiian. We also had, I always forget one of them. It's terrible of me. They ended up selling them actually in the 60s to the Sheraton Group. But they were about 30% of the hotel rooms available in Waikiki. So first it was the Royal Hawaiian, and then the Moana. In 1951, after the war, they built the Surfrider. And then in 1955, they built the Princess Kalilani. And so that was their whole like reboot. And they spent about $10 million after the war just on the hotels, renovating them as well. And then in 1959, they ended up selling them, that group, to the Sheraton Company, which today they're still part of the historic Sheraton kind of portfolio. And they sold them for $18 million in 1959. So that would be a pretty penny today for sure. But yeah, it's definitely, it was a changing time. The war had a huge impact on life here on the estate. We sort of noticed between 1930 and the census, which is the last born census, where you have, you know, a pretty big staff still here. And in some ways it's artificially sort of increased because you have almost 6 or 7 nurses in addition to the normal household staff. You still have a few people that are commuting back and forth, but you know, you have housemaids, ladies' maids, nurses, laundresses, gardeners, butlers, teamsters, teamster as in driving the horse-drawn carts on property. That one sometimes confuses people when they see the census records in the kitchen. Laborers, a chef, a cook, and housemen that were living on site. And then you have additional staff that are commuting even during that period from nearby Redwood City and San Carlos. You have the chauffeur living here, you know, as well as some second butlers. But that definitely retracts, not only when the Roths, after they move in 1937, right before, you know, that sort of wartime, you know, efforts are happening right in there, but you get a contracted staff size, and then you also get a noticeably older staff. So we don't have as many people in their 20s and 30s anymore. They're definitely 50s into just a much broader group that are coming in. So you still have gardeners, you have a caretaker living on site, you have housemen, cook and chef, the chauffeur, a few maids, but we know that more people were living off site by 1940. But yeah, we definitely, we have a lot going on with rationing and trying to talk about cooking in the kitchen this year. You know, not only were the family still entertaining, but they were entertaining a lot of people that were related to the war effort. You know, Mrs. Roth was volunteer chairman of the San Francisco Red Cross, and so she commuted up to San Francisco almost 5 days a week. She was just endlessly fundraising during that period from all of the stories. And we know that her daughters were helping in the Red Cross. We have a few pictures of them in their uniforms, and we're trying to dig up even more information about what they were doing. During that period, you know, both the twins got married, and her sister had gotten married here on site. But when Lurleen got married, she had a small wartime service in the local church and a really small contracted reception here. And we have a picture of her husband in his army uniform coming in the front door with her in a very sedate wedding gown compared to the big train that her sister had worn just a few years before. And she moved in here because he was actually in the skiing division in the Alps. And he even was a POW, like lost prisoner of war. They weren't sure. There was a time, she told me, when she didn't know if he was alive or dead, and that she came back here to live with her mother at Filoli during the war years. So that was, some really incredible stories happening on site. It was a tumultuous time for them here as well. So not only with their business, but also with the family, there was a lot going on.
And then I also want to ask you about the Victory Garden idea. So can we assume that the grounds at Filoli, did they have Victory Gardens?
Yeah, it's been one of those areas that we wish that there was more direct evidence laying around. It would have been absolutely bizarre for them to not have increased their vegetable yield, but we know from the Bourne period there was already big vegetable gardens and fruit gardens that were established and already planted. And so we sort of can presume that they were doing a lot of canning and production in a lot of ways the same way that they always would. You know, this has always been a very self-sufficient on a lot of the timeline here. You know, we had in the early years, we had cattle all the way through Mrs. Roth's period. We know that she was also keeping cattle on property. And if you're ever driving down Old Kenyatta Road, the next time you go to come in, you know, right where you drive through that blasted stone piece, just south of us, kind of in between the north and the south gate, that's 8.5 acres that used to be a part of Filoli. And so the original road used to go around it like a triangle. And it was about 1947 that Mrs. Roth lost 8.5 acres of the leased land from the water company, which is what our front area is. And she writes, and we have the actual letters back and forth in the archives to them, well, where else are you going to give me 8.5 acres? Because I have cattle that are grazing on that land right now. And so Alex, our director, or our chief operations officer now, Alex put me in the little truck a few months back, and he drove me all the way out there to the old cow pen that is up there. And it's right up at the top of that little mountain area, that little crest. And sure enough, there's a truck chute and a pen, and there's still a trough. And it really clearly shows where she was keeping cattle. And so we know that that tradition continued. I'm still trying to figure out what exact breed she was keeping on property, how many she was keeping, but she was very adamant that she needed another 8.5 acres to make up for it. So you'd think, you know, you have the ability to get fresh meat, which would have been very important during wartime rationing. You know, it isn't like today where everybody was sort of left to their own devices about how much toilet paper we're really going to buy, right? You got little ration stamps that would be pulled out, and they told you what you could buy. And over time, they got more elaborate, so that some of them were like little tearaways. And they would tell you, this is good for one ration. And you could get sugar, meat, flour. And over time, they got even more complicated. And you could get little ones that would say that they were for coffee, specifically, which could be very important for all you coffee drinkers. I would be desperately seeking tea. But, they got even more complicated. And so they would be for everything that you need. And you don't really realize, when you're cooking, this would have been a staff of like 30 people. And so they would have been pooling their ration books to try to get as much as possible. And then the cooks and the chefs here in the kitchen would be trying to stretch those while still doing these formal dinners and having, whether it was military people coming or other shipping magnates in the area, they were still serving and trying to entertain as well as keeping up their own staff. So it could be really complicated, for sure.
It sounds like it. Yeah, I was telling Julie earlier today, folks, that I just found my great aunt Blanche's ration cards, ration coupons, and it was funny because we were all telling this story at Filoli right now. So you never know when you open a drawer or a box what you might find. That was pretty cool to see them all tied together like that.
Oh yeah.
Julie, I know that our viewers would love to take a little walk around tour, and you can maybe show them some of the cool new things we've got in some of the other spaces there. So if you wouldn't mind, and folks, I'll encourage you to ask us questions too as you think of them.
I'm gonna just switch camera views here. I know this was something you were hoping for last week. So I figured out how to make it happen. So this is, the main kitchen, which in a lot of ways hasn't changed overall, that much, but we have done quite a number of projects recently in here. We actually restored the floor. So now you have this beautiful linseed oil linoleum floor, which is a size match to the original linoleum that was featured in the house. There's only, I think, 2 rooms that still have the original 1917 linoleum. One of them is the floor of the silver safe in the study, or family room. And one is in the larder, which is just out in the hallway, which is home to our downstairs copier machine these days. And so I used those 2 rooms to try to get as close as we could get on the color. But linseed oil linoleum doesn't come in this 6.5-inch size anymore. It comes in these big 20-inch tiles. And so I sweet talked, and we paid a little bit extra for it, but the factory laser cut these specifically for us. And they did a special die batch, and then we were able to order, a little bit of overstock so that if we needed to make repairs down the road, we would have it. So it was really fun to get to bring this look and feel back into the room. And we did that about, I guess it's almost 2 years ago now. And then we also had a water leak that had been above us from one of the fireplaces. Sometimes I wonder, keeping up these big roofs and everything is always an ongoing struggle for us. And water infiltration, just like in your own home, is something that you're constantly on the lookout for. And so we actually did quite a lot of plaster repair in here to these beautiful coved ceilings, which are almost 22 feet. So we did that work as well, about the same time that we were doing the floor. And then what we've been really focused on is trying to now interpret the room back. So whenever you're looking at these spaces, you're kind of dealing with what the room started out as and then what the room is today. So this beautiful hood is actually the 1917 original hood. That's the Bourne era hood. But the stove is a World War II replacement. So this is a Matson, basically nautical stove. And so during the war, the original stove, which you can see by the black panel here, was almost 3.5 to 4 feet wider than the stove. It was an it was oil driven, that was what it burned on. And they were unable to replace parts that broke during World War II. And so the Roths had a very smart thing. They said, we have an awful lot of stoves on ships. Let's take one of those out. And so this is an electric stove. And so it actually has these Edison hot point controls that are up top so that you wouldn't bump into them in rough seas. It has a nice big top deck. It has these hang-on bars, again, because if you were the poor cook in the middle of rough seas, you'd want to hang on. And all of those doors lock, so they won't fly open. So they used this and they didn't replace it, and it up until a few years ago, it was still actively working and being used. Now for electrical safety and fire prevention, we don't use it anymore, but it did work and it had a long, wonderful life. And so when we looked at the room, we really said, well, you can't be older than this stove because we don't have the original stove. So we sort of said, well, let's set the room back into that 1940s appearance. And part of that was also helped by, this whole wall actually got replaced with a GE marigold yellow kitchen cabinet set, which looks very much like the little pastry room. And this is basically a whole kitchen worth of GE crammed in this little room, which having cleaned it on a few occasions now, I can tell you is the size of a whole standard kitchen when you don't have this giant room next to you for comparison. But what you can see is these Born era cabinets, they just replaced the original oak countertop on them and then put the GE in right next to it and painted them to match. And so they did this also in the butler's pantry with the teal cabinets, but they had also done that out here in the main kitchen. And when Michael Douglas's movie, The Game, shot on site in the 90s, they actually chopped the front of those cabinets off and they built this mock wall of cabinetry to match the original Born era cabinets that are still on the western side of the room. So what I had was Hollywood cabinets that looked like they were from the teens, a floor that was the 1960s, cabinets, that were a mix, but really looked more mid-century before those were put in. And then our cold room had been entirely sort of abandoned in a lot of ways. It had been a storage room for many, many years. And so we decided a few years ago, well, let's show this room so you can see where the floor changes. Let's show what happened in the most well-preserved room, and then let's really play up the 40s. And so I've been hunting for a new refrigerator. Well, this is our new 1938 refrigerator. It's a beautiful little GE fridge, and it's come to us from History San Jose, just south of us a little bit. And my colleague there, Ken, has been wonderful enough to let it come to Filoli and spend time with us. And then you have the built-in cabinet, which is original. And if you sort of look, you can see there's sort of this big tiled niche, right? And so what originally went there is in the teens, when the house was originally built, this fit a 7-foot porcelain tiled McRae refrigerator unit. And that whole thing was a wall full of maybe 9 compartments that were built in flush to the wall, and they had those big chrome locking handles. And we know that Tony the Iceman used to deliver ice. And then it had some refrigeration to assist it, but it was a big McRae unit. But we know from pictures of this room later that the Roths took out the McRae, probably, at the end of its life, about 20 years. And so right about this same time, they just started slipping little modern refrigerators into the niche. The cooling unit on top, and we've slipped it right into the cavity that they left. They used some tiled board to fill in the gap there. And then the shelving units on the other side here, these had been removed. So let's see if I can get back a little bit here so you can see them. It's a built-in cabinet wall, and they had been removed when this was a storage room. And so one of our shelter-in-place projects was the facilities crew, Ted, did a beautiful job of rebuilding these with beautiful Douglas fir and getting those all ready based on the blueprints for the room in the archives, as well as reference in the nearby cold room. And then I've been busy collecting and canning fake food to put in there. So I'm still waiting. The lower shelves worth of canned food are still locked up under a shelter-in-place order with one of our museum colleagues in Cupertino, but they'll be coming out soon. And so we're really excited to get to show off, how the room would have historically been used, including a local Folgers can, which is a 1937 can.
Julie, the jars of food and the idea of canning and preserving food sounds like something that was pretty popular during the wartime era. I do have a question for you. What types of food were on the menu during this period of time? Was this pretty typical of what you'd see?
Yeah, you would definitely have a lot of fruit. And, from here, we had, both the fruit garden and the gentleman's orchard were still in full production mode during this period. And so you definitely would have had a lot of fruit. Like up here, you've got pears and apricots and cherries being canned. You would have definitely had some of those pears and apricots from the garden, things like fresh green beans, stewed tomatoes. All of those things would have been important to be canning, and really all of the kind of produce that you could from the garden. And so during these Victory Garden years, you would just see all these advertisements with just packed full canning rooms. And you were supposed to grow a Victory Garden. That's what they were really recommending that everybody do. And you could, your front lawns got dug up. In San Francisco, the entire lawn right in front of City Hall was a Victory Garden. That whole beautiful square was row after row of vegetables. And, you were supposed to, they gave you brochures, they told you how to cook and what to do with them, and really what to look for. And even, things like Jell-O, it was all about how you would make your salad, make those fresh cut vegetables last a little longer. And things like eating for victory, healthy home front cooking with your wartime rations. Both here and in the UK, they would give you those kind of recipes that would feature your wartime rationing and really allow you to stretch food as far as possible.
And I have a question. We talked a little bit about the staff, but how many staff members would be working in the kitchen at one time or during this period of time?
Well, you definitely would have had a mix. So you had always a chef and a cook. We always had both. During the Roth era, we all remember Alma Johnson, or during the Bourne era, excuse me, Alma, their Swedish cook, but they actually had an English chef, Jonathan Mosley. So then during the Roth period, you have Key Lowe. And Key had worked for the family since it was about 1916, 1918 until 1961. He was almost 75 years old when he retired. And he would have been in charge of the kitchen here at Filoli during the war years. And he was well known for, his cooking and styles of cooking. He didn't work from recipes, everything was from memory. And I do love that quite a few people recognize like what sort of meals he liked to make. And he was constantly using things that Mrs. Roth experienced when she was traveling. And she would bring things home for him. So like she brought home spices from India. And so he would make her. If he did cook Chinese style dishes, which everybody sort of says was not that common for him, he would sort of do chop suey and some bean sprouts or Chinese style roast pig. Chow mein was another big favorite. And cookies, usually walnut or peanut cookies, were very, very popular. People still remember Key's cooking in here. So you had a lot of things from all over the world, flavors from all over the world being constantly made here in the kitchens. And so, all these different cultures have their own ways of sort of rationing food and making things stretch a little farther, and sauces can help you do that often. And so I think he would have really put all of his talent to work to stretch as much of the rationing as he could.
I have a question about when we were in the cold room there, there's another door that leads out.
Yeah.
And is that just, so there's a door that closes and another door that leads out. What's the reasoning for the layout there? Do you know?
I think that on the original, it's an original tiled port in and out of that space. And so what I've always thought is that the McRae might have had a side accessible location there, and there's actually a door in the middle of it that's in the hallway that you'll often see when you're right there next to the staircase, and that led into the back of the unit. So I've always thought that that was maybe where the ice loaded, so that they wouldn't have to come into the kitchen side.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one picture that looks like it's about the mid-1960s of this room, and it's actually almost the same identical view. And you can see that there's a little fridge tucked in right where our fridge is. But what you can see over here on this little door is you can see the silver handle of another fridge sticking out. And so what I've always thought is like maybe they did like a quick, you need your milk, you need dairy, those things that you're constantly grabbing, that there was another fridge that was turned so that you didn't have to open that door and go in there, that you could kind of just grab and go.
Another thing that I think folks are interested in is the fact that, we have, this is an area of the house where the guests wouldn't really come, right? So our guests, our visitors all come through here and get to see it all, but your Roth family guests or your Bourne guests, they wouldn't come through here. And that is also the screen porch and what we call the service courtyard. So this whole area here was really a work area, right? And what would they use that service courtyard area for?
Well, right out the back, before the ADA ramp was put in, there was just steps that came right down. And the service courtyard right outside the window really was full functional service. So the gates, the double gates would be open to allow the cars to drive in after they had dropped off people in the front if they were guests. If you were family, the chauffeur dropped you off at the back door. So, when you were coming in and out, you often came in the back door unless you had guests with you.
Okay.
So you're entering the house like family if you come in the back door, sort of thing. But out here, where today the plants and everything are for the garden shop, there was a dog kennel. Mr. Roth had multiple hunting dogs on property. The twins had little Scotty dogs. Mrs. Roth had poodles. So there was multiple kennels on property. There was one here in the courtyard. There was one on the other side of the garden shop today, right where the truck is usually parked with the kind of the compost being pulled out of the garden. And then right up kind of behind the visitor center, there's a huge complex that's for the kennels. And there's still the hunting dog kennels and a big flagpole that are up there. There's quite a lot of poison oak, so it's always a tricky spot to get to. But that area is still there. And so out here, you'd have the dog kennels, you'd have laundry, where the cherry trees are, you'd have clotheslines running back and forth. The arbor that goes up and over where the plants usually are is original from the Bourne era. And if next time you walk under it, notice that the brick is sloped into a central drain. That's where you wash the car. So that's a specific spot designed with a hose bib and draining to allow the chauffeurs, and there was always at least one chauffeur, if not two, living on property. And they lived there in the house in the chauffeur's cottage. And then through the back door, they would exit their cottage and they would go into the shop room. And there's actually a grease pit that's in the middle of the floor back there that allows you to work underneath your car, just like when you take it to the oil stop place. There's a full mechanics grease pit there, and then double doors that open into what today is the garden shop. So you could fit 9 vehicles in the garden shop garage space according to the blueprints. And it really had a spot where all of your mechanics pamphlets and the repair books, which I actually grew up with. My family did parts business, so I grew up in the warehouse. And so we used to reference those books all the time when we were selling parts. And so they had a whole wall that was just parts books. And then, you know, the pit, and you had a whole space where you could maintain this amazing fleet of vehicles that the families both had.
I have a question about the dogs. Were the dogs allowed in the house?
Yes, they were. There are pictures of them inside the house. There's also pictures of them running around on the grounds with their preferred human. we seem to have had a few preferred people with different dogs over the years. You'll usually see Mrs. Roth's poodle running around with her, and he was about knee height. So he wasn't as tall as a big standard, but he wasn't a little toy poodle either. He was kind of that mid-size. And Mr. Roth, I have a few pictures of Bill in the reception room, like petting the dog's head, who's resting it right on one of the chairs, you know, and he's got a cocktail in hand, and the dogs are clearly there. Toto, who you see the little statues of throughout the house. We have the counting game for our junior visitors. If they find all 5 Totos, a whole paw full, they get a Toto sticker usually to take home with them. And he lived here most often during the boarding period in the mid-20s, about 26 to 27. And he's the most photogenic of the dogs. We have the most pictures of him. But we have other dogs that were here as well. Mrs. Bourne, Agnes, had a dog. We know that she bought a dog for the chauffeur's daughter, Alice, who would have been playing right out here in the courtyard. They shared a birthday, and she was given Dawn Elder, was what she named the puppy on their shared birthday. So you would have had kids playing and, you know, running around and riding tricycles and bicycles, and they like to play baseball on the front corner of the lawn next to the plane trees there. So you definitely had a lot of activity. I know when the Roths moved in, you know, they had a sleeping porch at Waikiki that the twins absolutely adored. And so there's a porch just above the butler's pantry next to us that you can see from the outside of the house that's off of the master bedroom. And they immediately enclosed that and made a sleeping porch because the girls missed having the one at Waikiki so much. But both Lurleen and Brennis told me it was terribly loud because everyone was working. So they said they spent one night in it and they never used it again. So their mother turned it into a bird aviary for her pet parrots.
I think we also know too that those the bell tower chimes, and it chimes all hours, right?
Yeah, it keeps going. You definitely hear it. And it's even the chicken, the rooster that's up on top of it was the insignia for the estate during the Bourne era. It's a specific Chanticleer rooster, which the Bournes also raised on property to show their support from World War I. So we know both families were very involved with the war effort.
And I seem to recall hearing from the grandchildren that they would come running in the kitchen to steal a piece of cake, or there was always cake available.
There was always cake and cookies. And much like to some of the kids during Alma's time, they knew that they could get cookies and occasionally, you know, ice cream out of Alma. You usually had to take a big giant hug. She'd usually go for a hug first, and then they would get a treat. But even during the Roth era, they knew Key had a big soft spot for the kids coming in to beg a sweet. So they definitely had fun with those, and he's well remembered for those.
I have some questions too about the uniforms that we have on display here. Are those authentic period? Did we recreate those?
Yeah, we have quite a lot of pictures that we've received in the last few years from one big album came from the Bournes. Alex has given us a book to borrow and scan, and that had a lot of the Bourne era staff uniforms. And then the Roth family didn't have as many staff pictures, only a handful, but staff's families have continued to bring back photos of what their family remembers about life on site. And so what we've done is we've looked at those, and then we've purchased period uniforms. So like this is about a late 30s uniform that's worn, as is the jacket and the pants are early 40s in here for our chef, he's sort of standing off to her side here in his uniform. And we know from pictures of Key working in the house here that he was often in a full dress white, kind of chef's jacket. And that especially when they were out to greet everyone, he would also have the high hat. I just don't have a dress form with a head.
We don't have too much time left, but if folks have questions, I encourage them. I do have a question. Folks would like to hear a little more about Chef Key. What happened? Did he stay on as long as Mrs. Roth was in the house? I seem to recall stories about his kids as well.
Yeah, Key worked for the family until 1961. And I mean, he was almost 75 at that point. He'd worked for the family since they lived on Jackson Street in San Francisco. And he was ready to retire, but what he said was that he was unwilling to leave Lurleen to train someone new while Bill was sick. So her husband had begun suffering strokes, an unfortunately common occurrence for the men of this household, from both families. And he kept suffering one stroke after another. So it was in the mid 40s, it was 46, 47 that they put the pool in, actually for his rehabilitation after suffering strokes. And so he really said he put off as long as he could to retire until he really told her he was just really not up to it anymore. And she did something that was really amazing for the time period. Both her and her husband, they paid Key a pension for the next 25 years of his life. He lived to 100. He died 6 months before Lurleen did, at 95. They were about 5 years apart. And they really seemed to have had an amazing working relationship. Like, they genuinely enjoyed one another and seemed to enjoy teasing one another and working together, because the chef would set the menu with the lady of the house's approval and input. So they would look at their social calendar, make all those plans together. And he really seems to have had a genuine affection for her, and she for him. And so we do have a few pictures of her like dressed to the nines in here, posed with the staff, that staff took on their own camera and have given back to us. But he had he had two sons. Lung Ho Lo came to work with him at age 12. He came over from China, where Key's wife had lived in China, and he would often send money back to her. There was huge racism here in California. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was an unhealthy climate and a really harmful climate for them. And so his first son, when he came here at 12, he couldn't go to schools and learn and study in English. He was primarily taught in Chinatown in Chinese, very traditionally. And then he came here to work his way up in the kitchen. He tells stories in his oral history of like being beaten walking around San Francisco. I mean, it was a brutal time. But a few years later, I mean, just the difference of a decade, his brother came over again, very young, in 1940, and he was able to go, and that was Chu Young Lo. He was able to come here in 1941 and go immediately into English schools that were more integrated. And he's the one that we know the most about his later schooling, because he went to UC Berkeley, he did his engineering degree, and the Roths paid his tuition as a part of his compensation. And they really encouraged him to continue to like push for his dreams. And his son and daughter, they contributed towards their tuition, about $5,000 and $7,000 each down the road. And they always remembered that, you know, Key's utilities and his rent for his apartment, it was fully furnished with brand new furniture in 1961 when he retired. He made a big deal that she had purchased every single thing new for him. And he lived there the rest of his life. And they always said that they really, I've had the chance to talk with great grandsons and everything in the last few years, and they said, we were encouraged for that American dream. And it was possible for the younger son to do that more directly. He got into welding during the war years, and Mr. Roth got him a job working for the defense companies in the Bay here. So there was connections that were able to be made there. You know, I know we've had other lectures where we've talked about Taga, and Taga's wartime story here at Filoli is heartbreaking. He went to the Japanese internment camps, and you know the family remembers driving him to the pickup points and picking him up and bringing him home. But he had a very different wartime story here. And so we have those good histories and we have difficult histories, and they're all a part of our one history, you know. There's just a lot of different voices here. So we're digging into more of these and trying to tell more stories and more shared stories of what it was like to live at Filoli. Because it hasn't just been our two families. There was also, you know, upwards of 30 people living here.
And thank you, Julie, for sharing that information. I think it is really important that we talk about all of the stories of all the people that made Filoli happen, that built it, that worked there, that supported the families. For so many years, we've just told the stories of the Roths and the Bournes, but there are many interesting, some heartbreaking, some heartwarming stories that we had to tell, that we still have to tell, that we still have to learn about and share. And we're committed to that, to trying to find those stories and share them with our audience as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. We are so appreciative of your support of Filoli, and we hope that you enjoyed this visit, Cocktails with the Curator in the Kitchen.
We'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Cheers.